You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. Thank you for joining me. Before we get started, I do need to issue a warning. Today, we're going to talk about some fairly controversial subjects because we will acknowledge politics. I know it's one of the taboo things we don't talk about these days. We don't talk about sex, we don't talk about politics, and we don't talk about diet, but today we have to talk about it. It's my privilege today to have with me an author and professor that I deeply admire. It's Dr. Kristin Du Mez. She's the author of the book, Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith that Fractured a Nation. Now, I read this book just recently, and it put together for me a number of pieces that had been building in my mind, but I had not been able to put them together. How did we get to where we are? Because you got to understand my story. I have been a lifelong member of the Republican Party since 1988. Until 2015, when it became, in my estimation, a personality cult. And I've tried to figure out how in the world have we reached the point where evangelicals support systems and structures and persons who are, for all intents and purposes, very questionable in their relationship to what we value as Christians. So I wanted to explore some of this with Dr. Du Mez and get her input as a scholar, as a leading thinker within the academic and Christian world today. So Dr. Du Mez, thank you. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be here.
I so appreciate your book. Now, you know, the reviews that you can read about the books are pretty staggering as well. You know, it's one of the common one was must read. And when I posted recently that, man, I read your book and it was mind blowing, I was surprised at the number of people that responded back to me that they too had read your book and been equally blown away. So for those that are listening today that maybe haven't read the book or not familiar with it, what would you give us an overview of it and tell us about what the book is about and maybe why you wrote it?
Sure. So the book, actually, the idea for the book started more than 15 years ago. And it was actually students at the university where I teach, Christian University. I teach at Calvin, a university in Michigan. And they brought to my attention a book that was very popular at the time. It was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And I just finished up a lecture in U.S. history on Teddy Roosevelt, showing my students how masculinity worked in history, how Teddy Roosevelt's muscular Christianity connected with American empire and military power and religion and race. And they just said, Professor Du Mez, you really need to read this book. And I looked at John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. I knew it was very popular in Christian dorms and small groups and churches at the time. And I saw immediately what they were talking about. Eldredge opens his book with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt and sketches this very militant conception of what he called Christian masculinity. And at that time, I was paying attention to what else was going on in American evangelicalism. This was the early years of the Iraq War, 2005, 2006, and we saw evangelicals far and away, more than other Americans, embrace the war in Iraq, embrace preemptive war in general, condone the use of torture. And I started to ask, much as I had in terms of historical literature surrounding Teddy Roosevelt, how are conceptions of militant Christian masculinity perhaps linked to this aggressive foreign policy? And so I started to dig in. I discovered that there were many books like Eldredge's. I mean, Eldredge's went on to sell more than 4 million copies. Mm-hmm. And all of them were sketching out at the time this very militant conception of Christian masculinity that also led to a very militant conception of Christianity itself. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I researched this for about a year and then set it aside. I had other stuff going on. And I had this nagging question of how how mainstream is this? What I was reading was really disturbing, seemed really extreme. This was the, days of Mark Driscoll preaching this stuff from pulpits. And I thought, I mean, I know it's popular, but what do I do with it? So I set it aside, took up some other projects, and then it was in the fall of 2016 when we saw white evangelicals really begin to embrace Donald Trump as candidate and then as president of the United States. And that's when I dusted off some of this old research to understand how this militant conception of Christian manhood, this need for a strong protector, ruthless protector, a warrior masculinity might have led to the embrace of a man like Donald Trump, who, as they put it, was their strong man.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was fascinating. While I was going through your book, you were quoting and referencing all the authors that I've read that shaped my much of my worldview, even some of the more ones that most, maybe some in our listening audience may have never read, people like R.J. Rushdoony, Gary North, all of those, the whole very, much of the libertarian economic think tanks. I'd read those. I thought Ludwig von Mises was a great, economist, and all of these things. And so probably if I would have read your book 10 years ago, maybe I would have blown a gasket and called you a few choice names. But somewhere in my journey, it started dawning on me. And I think it probably began with, as you referenced, the whole thing with the wars, and understanding that, wars aren't what we should be involved in. Sometimes, it's probably the worst. It's the least of horrible evils, but we shouldn't be the ones chanting and raving about it. I posted yesterday a thought that had been running through my mind about how in the Old Testament, the children of Israel kept falling into idolatry, especially around the worship of Baal and Ishtar, the Queen of Heaven. And the Queen of Heaven was the god of war and power. And that seems to be what we have exchanged. We kept the name Jesus, but we seem to have inserted this god of war and power.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, at its heart, on the surface, this is a book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism. Those words aren't in the title of the book anywhere or subtitle because my publisher decided those words were too big for a title or subtitle. But essentially, it's a book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism. But at its heart, it really is a book about power. It is, what is the relationship of power, political power, cultural power, religious power to the gospel of Christ? What does that look like over history? And then there is a kind of critical framing underlying all of this, which is, is this the way it should be? Is this what we as Christians ought to be oriented around?
Right. Unpack that for me some. This whole issue of power, the seduction of power that we as Christians have often, when somebody comes along and says, I will be your strong man, I will defend you as Christians if you will just simply give me your allegiance. We've never done well with that.
No, we haven't. And I'm glad you brought it back to, biblical times and to the Israelites. Because I know when I was growing up reading those stories, I just time and again, come on, Israelites, pull it together. What is your problem? You have God talking directly to you. Can't you, figure this out over and over again? And yet here we are. I think that there are many different manifestations of power that surface in this book. There's the military power, this belief that, which is really built on the belief in Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. This idea of Christian America, that America is a special nation and has a special role to play, and that it was founded in a distinctively Christian way, and therefore the well-being of America is linked to the well-being of the church in the world, because again, America has a special role. And this really flourishes during the early years of the Cold War, when it made a lot of sense to Americans to see things in these terms. So communism was anti-God, it was anti-family, and it was anti-American
Mhm.
in their mind. And so we needed to defend all of these precious things. And the threat was clearly a military threat. And so therefore our defense of these things must be a military defense and a militant one. And that really kind of frames things in this book. We start off there, and men had a very particular role to play because gender traditionalism or gender difference was kind of located at the heart of Orthodox Christianity by many of these folks, by people like Billy Graham and these early neo evangelicals. And so they saw that to be faithful. Men and women have different roles, and the male role is to be provider and especially protector.
Mhm.
And so that is up to that is God's command that men protect, that they protect their faith, their family, and their nation. And so to do that, then, all right, the stakes are so incredibly high. Protection might require violence. It might require preemptive violence. That can be actual violence in the case of war. It can be, ruthless politics in the case of culture wars, and it's again a very kind of hierarchical sense as well, that God has given some people authority, particularly men, and then pastors and God appointed government officials, and that everybody else, in order to be obedient to Christ, must submit to those authorities. So it's the
Mhm.
assertion of power, the submission to power, and the defense through power of all that is good and true. And that really is at the heart of the evangelical identity that emerges in the years after World War II, and that really propels them to the center of American power in many ways.
Mhm. Now, historically, how have you seen this play out within the church? I know there's been various epochs of time where Christians have, or Christianity or Christendom has come under that same type of thing. We've been here before. The story
Yes.
never ends differently.
We have, and history is a story of continuity and of change. So if you want to look for precedent for this kind of conflation of Christianity and power, you will find it. You will find it in many cases. You can go back to Constantine. You can trace it all the way through Christian history. But and that's important to do, but it's not a direct line, right? And
Mhm.
there's also a lot of change over time, and there are many examples where Christianity has flourished on the margins, and where Christianity has not been attached to power. And often, I think historically, you can find that those are the places where you have the kind of truest witness of the church. And you
Mhm.
have that running alongside this story too. I'm teaching a course right now on race in American Christianity, and we are looking at the tradition of prophetic Christianity in the African American church tradition. And
Mm.
it's a good reminder that there's not one story, and there's not a direct line. We have a lot of examples of this kind of meshing of faith and power, but a lot of other examples as well. So nothing in the end is inevitable. But what I try to do in Jesus and John Wayne is show how this particular tradition became a dominant tradition
Mhm.
in American evangelicalism and in the American church in general, and how that came to be. Ultimately, my hope is so that we can decide if this is where we want to be.
One of the questions that I had when reading the book, as well as I've received some emails on, and some messages through my social media, when people heard I was going to be interviewing you, was that it was the same. We all had this. One of the same questions was, I agree, but now what? What if,
Yes.
as both as men, specifically to the gender issue, to the man,
Mhm.
that, it's like I've told my wife multiple times over the last few years that if we lived another 1,000 generations and every man lived perfectly, we could still not undo the damage that we men have done to women, to others, to one another.
Mhm.
But how shall we then live, to quote Francis Schaeffer?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying I'm a historian, and I speak with more authority about the past than I do when I'm trying to offer recommendations for the present or future. But I know we're all in this together. We're all asking these questions, and we all need to be. So I think a few lessons that I could draw from my research. Um, One is, just the importance of knowing how things came to be does situate us well to have conversations that are otherwise incredibly unproductive. I have been astounded by the reception of this book within evangelical circles. I mean, it's a harsh book, and it tells, I think, some harsh truths. And I anticipated much more pushback. Instead, I have the book has been overwhelmingly embraced by the evangelicals who are reading it. At least I can't speak for those who aren't communicating. I would say, I get hundreds. I've gotten hundreds of letters since this book published 6 months ago, and I'd say 99 to 1 they are just effusively thankful.
Wow.
And they contain similar themes. This is the story of my life, and I'm not okay with this, right? And it's by finally understanding again how we got to this point, the decisions that were made by individuals at critical moments for specific reasons, often to enhance their own power, but then covered with this religious language, covered with this, quote unquote Christian orthodoxy, sold to people as this is the way to be obedient. That just, I think, incapacitated many people
Mm-hmm.
to see what was actually happening. Now, what's interesting is the letters that I'm getting, none of them are saying it's not my fault, that I got hoodwinked here. Like, without exception, they're saying, I had no idea the fullness of this situation, but I am acknowledging my complicity in it. And clearly I did not have eyes to see. Why didn't I? Why was I blind to this? Why was I willingly consuming this? And they can understand that it was doing some things for them and that they were not listening to other voices. So advice now, I would say humility is hugely important, but really important to kind of step back and think, who have we excluded from our religious communities?
Mm-hmm.
Who have we excluded from our conversations? Which voices have in fact been calling this out, have been naming these truths for generations? And why were we not even placing ourselves in proximity to those voices to even be able to hear them? And here I'm talking about race. I'm talking about the segregated reality that is American Christianity and American evangelicalism, that for a variety of reasons and a lot of intentional ones, white Christians have separated themselves from Black Christians. I think of people who have been defined out of evangelicalism because of some perceived heresy, whether it was along lines of gender or race or social justice or sexuality, and defined as, not just I disagree with you, but you are not one of us and I will no longer listen to you. And then who has been included, even if they may be espousing, frankly, racist views or others.
Mm-hmm.
So think about how we've defined our communities, and think about how we might want to redefine our communities. And again, listening to the voices that we have not been listening to is a really important first step.
That is so good. Because when I reflect back on my journey of how I began to break from from that, though I still find myself still peeling off the layers and the layers and the multiple layers. I was working in Russia and developing a church planting movement in Russia back in starting in the mid '90s, and I met for the very first time another missionary from the United Kingdom who was fully devoted to Jesus Christ and a socialist. And for me, it was like, oh, for me, it was a black swan moment. If you're familiar with the story of the black swan, they swore up and down for all of science that it can't exist, that does not exist. And, in my mind, I'm going, these things cannot exist.
Yes.
And when she told me that she was, and I knew her.
Mhm.
I knew her faith. I knew how intelligent she was. And, not that she bought into the whole Hugo Chavez, that stuff, all the stereotypes, but it started me thinking, and I think that just conversation and getting to know the other
Yes. Yes.
is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in this book, I mean, at the end of the book, I contain some of those, or I include a few of those stories of how have people abandoned this narrative? How have people walked away from this ideology? Because on the one hand, it is so deeply entrenched. These values are just so deeply entrenched that they're taken for granted by many American Christians. This patriotism, this militarism, these definitions of what it means to be a faithful Christian. But I include a few brief stories of people who have walked away, and what were the kind of deciding factors. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's about meeting somebody who is the other, who doesn't fit what they have been told their entire life, that good Christians are not this,
Right.
that a good Christian is only, is a complementarian. And then somebody meets this lovely Christian couple who just are doing the work of the Lord, and they're egalitarians. It just doesn't compute until so it's that personal witness. It's, many Bible studies in evangelical circles are gender specific. So you have your men's Bible study and you have your women's Bible study, and college groups too, campus Bible studies. And so what happens then is that there are young men who are discipled in this like gender segregated community, and they are talking about women and talking about men in ways that a few women in the room are going to challenge that. And just the presence of those women, of smart, theologically sophisticated women, are going to disrupt those truths that they are telling each other. And as soon as they meet, that was a conversion experience for at least one of the men that I talk about. He studied the Bible with women and realized after all those years that they are wise and they are perceptive. And then if that's true, then what of his commitments does he need to rethink? So it very much is a personal thing. We need to be around people who are different from us and listen to them, not to rebut them, but to learn from them.
It's so good. I've been struggling through these years, the sinful impulse that I have to exalt myself and subjugate the other.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what we all want to do. It seems to be the stain of sin, the wound of sin in all of us,
Yeah.
is always the self-exaltation and subjugation of the other.
Yeah.
It's interesting, both in the book and amongst evangelicals, even the militant branches of it, one of the patron saints of it right now. You always hear these Dietrich Bonhoeffer quotes. Because you were talking about, the Christians who would be considered heretics. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer would not be welcomed in evangelical Christian churches.
No. Well, which Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Is it the real historical Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or is it Eric Metaxas's version of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Which he turns into essentially an American evangelical in his own image in that book. But you're right. The historical Dietrich Bonhoeffer would not fit well in many evangelical
No. Well,
congregations.
even Metaxas slipped and fell into the truth when he, in his book, when he acknowledged that when Bonhoeffer would come to the United States, he would only be able to hear the gospel preached in the Black churches.
Yep. Yeah,
And
it's
he would
hard
only
to get away from that fact. Yes.
Yeah, and that's just a very prominent thing that put the dots together here.
Yeah.
This man who was one of the few within the Christian community in Germany who withstood against fascism, Nazism, and because that's another myth, that the church stood against Hitler. It didn't. It joyfully joined in with him.
It did.
Because he promised to make Germany great again. I mean, that was he's going to rebuild the greatness of the German Empire.
So, since we're being honest here and not holding back, I will say that the first article that I wrote on this topic that became this book was time to Trump's inauguration in 2017. And so exactly 4 years ago. And after publishing that, it was just a piece on white evangelical masculinity and militarism and how it explains the election of Donald Trump. And the piece went viral. So I knew it was resonating with a lot of people. And within a week, I received an email from a historian of 20th century Germany. And he shared with me some documents and from his own research, quotes from the German Christian movement about Christian masculinity. And they were word for word the same as what I had just published. And so the entire time I was writing this book, I was well aware of those connections. I actually lived in Germany. I've taught German history, and my outside field is in 20th century Germany, even though I'm a US historian by training. And so this was very much on my mind. But that until recently, this was something that we couldn't say publicly without kind of guaranteed backlash of, you're blowing things out of proportion. And so I considered all along, how should I address that in this book? Should I do that? And I ended up not primarily because I was afraid to, because I mean, with footnotes, you can provide the evidence necessary, but just the arc of the book needed to end somewhere else. At least when I finished it a year and a half ago. Now, I think that the arc as it has continued, and where we've seen actual violence, we've seen this insurrection. I think that is something that we can bring back into focus. And there are certainly lessons to be learned from the German Christian support for somebody like Hitler. And it's never a kind of perfect parallel at all, but certainly the ways in which good Christian people can be complicit in things that cause great harm.
Yeah. Susanna Heschel, if you've read her book, The Aryan Jesus, does
Mm,
a phenomenal job tracing the way that the German Christian movement, and virtually every major German scholar, Christian scholar, was a member of the Institute for the Eradication of Jewish Influence in German Christianity.
yeah.
And of course, she, if you're familiar with her, she's the daughter of Abraham Heschel, which was an incredible Jewish theologian that escaped Nazism and lived here in the United States to the end of his days. And again, it paints that same picture, though maybe they're not perfect parallels. They certainly are shadows and echoes that we need to be fearful of. And maybe someday you'll write a book, that helps people understand it does not end well.
No,
You
no.
know, the lover of history, I keep telling people that this thing, I go, look, it is the height of arrogance to think that we can escape history.
Yeah.
That this is the way it always ends.
Yeah.
This is not an aberration. This is a culmination.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And when I got to the end of this book, there was a real heaviness that I carried because I saw the power of this history that I had just traced. And again, this was a year and a half ago when I actually finished the writing. Then it went into production for a year. That's how publishing works. And
Right.
and so it was kind of out of my hands for a while. And so I had time just to consider this all. But I was, so I'd wonder, was I too pessimistic here? And I just couldn't get away from it. The conclusions that I came to, are not encouraging ones from the history that we have in front of us in terms of, where white evangelicals have been, what they have condoned, what they have supported, and what we might expect in the future. And so now we're at this inflection point, right? After the recent events of at the nation's capital, looking ahead to another inauguration, and looking, ahead to another potential case of violence or incidents of violence. And so, I mean, it's an open question to me, and I'm not sure how to parse this out, because on the one hand, there are other there is love, and there is, there's biblical truth within white evangelicalism. Certainly, there's a lot of goodness there. There's a lot of, many people who are writing to me, like wonderful, wonderful people, even as they have been complicit in this, and even as they acknowledge that they have been, and who are looking to rectify things, to confess, to lament, and to change. At the same time, there are these deeply embedded traditions that suggest that the ends will justify the means, that violence can be used to bring order, that there is a redemptive violence that Christians are called to wield. Add to the mix, there is the long-standing, decades-long history of being suspicious, not just of outsiders, but of outside sources of information. So we need our own media sources. Don't trust the mainstream media. Like, you add that into the mix, and there is certainly reason for concern in terms of what lies ahead. And so I think that inside evangelical circles, inside Christian churches right now, we need to be having these conversations with each other across political differences. And again, among people with whom we already have relationships, people who know us and we know them.
One question I received from a friend was, is there a particular book or of the Bible, or a particular Bible study resource that pairs with what you've written, that a pastor can use in his local church to have studies to help bring truth to people?
That's a really good question. I'm sure there are many, many. I can't think of one right now, and the studies that I participate in are more book studies than, the more, kind of Bible studies. But I might put that question out on social media, actually, because it would be interesting to see what resources, kind of Bible study resources, have other pastors or leaders found that speak directly to these themes. I'm sure there are many, many, many. But there's also the question of, I mean, the Bible speaks powerfully, but there's also the fact that this book demonstrates that each of us approaches the Bible through cultural lenses, through this value system. In fact, I was just having a conversation a couple weeks ago with a fairly prominent evangelical theologian who has ended up on the slightly more progressive side. But what he told me is, he's like, what, for 30 years, I have been battling, the movement you write about in your book, theologically, right? I've been having these theological conversations. We've been opening the Bible and getting nowhere. And he's like, and now I realize it was never about theology, right? It was, which isn't to say theology doesn't matter, but theology alone is not going to solve this. Opening the Bible together alone is not going to solve this until we understand the cultural lenses, the value system that we are bringing to that Bible. Only then will we be able to possibly, examine the Bible anew. Things like immigration reform, refugee status, things like this, that we've got some really clear Bible passages that we can look at, yet somehow those don't actually break through. We have, Jesus saying, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. Doesn't seem to make a difference until we can kind of peel away some of these layers and understand how people are hearing those passages.
Yeah, I was having a conversation just in the last few days. Of course, as we're recording this, the president was just impeached for a second time yesterday. And so the political height of tension is quite high. And a person that I know had just come out and said on Facebook, said that he endorsed going to civil war to kill all of these people, all these godless Democrats who are destroying our nation and trying to take us away from being Christian. So we need to have a war to kill them.
Yes.
And I'm reading and I'm thinking, and I contacted him and I said, you realize what you're saying here? You're willing to put me and several of your family members and everybody else to death because we think differently than you. Not that I'm a Democrat. It's just, I would be, if you want to go to war, you're wanting to kill people who don't think like you, and you're doing it in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't this inconsistent? And of course, he sent me a nice apology and said, "You're right. I just get worked up." Well, we just can't get worked up like that. The wrath of man never accomplishes the righteousness of God.
Well, I mean, and that's the question where we're at least my question is, this rhetoric is pervasive,
Yeah.
right? Every man has a battle to fight. God is warrior, and we are made in God's image to be warriors, right? This rhetoric, it does matter. It does, it's spiritual formation. And, how much it matters. And where is the line going to be drawn? That to me is the open question. How much is it metaphor? For some people, it's purely metaphor, but not for everyone. And we can see that when we look at American evangelicals' embrace of militarism, embrace of the death penalty, embrace of many of these practices that actually reflect that rhetoric. And so again, to me, it's an open-ended question. Where will the line be drawn?
It's great. Well, thank you so much, Doctor. I so appreciate you taking the time to hopefully stir the curiosity of some people that, this is not an exclusively political by any means discussion. It's much more of how can we reevaluate the way we're seeing the world and allowing the scriptures to once again recalibrate us. I just read a book last week called Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. And,
Yes.
that's a great book,
Yeah.
I may email my friend Ryan, who asked the question about the Bible or Bible studies. I think Walter Brueggemann wrote a very prophetic book back more than 40 years ago on the prophetic imagination.
Yeah.
And, there's a number of ways, and we just go back to what does the scripture say? Who is the God revealed to us
Yeah.
in the scriptures, and letting that shape us. Well, if people want to connect with you, learn more about your writing, your teaching, how can they connect with you?
Sure. I'm out on social media a lot, both Twitter and Facebook, and for both it's at KK Du Mez, which is actually spelled KKDUMEZ, like Du Mez. And I also have a website, KristinDuMez.com, and I try to post a lot of my writings there, interviews, things like that.
Well, Doctor, it's been a joy to have you with us, and I sure do appreciate it. Before I let you go, is there any other major thought or jewel that you'd like to leave with us?
I think I kind of skirted your question of kind of masculine guilt there. And so I think I will return to that for a moment. You
Okay,
said that,
please.
pride is there for all of us. And the thing is that I think that men, and particularly white men, have just had more freedom to exercise that pride. I don't think that white men are morally more prone to any of these things necessarily, certainly not as God created them. But the societies in which we live, the organizations that we structure, probably produce some of that. And I will say that for many men who have been caught up in this ideology, even as they have wielded power, they have also been harmed by that. And I know
Mhm.
that many men who have left this ideology have found it to be liberating and not at all, I mean, guilt-inducing in a way that kind of brings you down, but just in a way that frees you to be in genuine relationship with other members of the body in Christ. And so, the journey there might have some tough places, but in for many that I've heard from, it really has been a journey ultimately of joy, of belonging, and of Christian love and grace.
That is so true. Thank you. Thank you. And I've had that similar conversation with others, that and I think it's because we're as a as a white male American feeling the threat to our points of security,
Mhm.
but I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I said, look, these guys driving around in their pickup trucks with the "Don't tread on me" sticker, they're and I was very angry, and I called them snowflakes with assault weapons. I said, look, these people have never had to guess the number of bubbles in a bar of soap to vote. They've never been fired because their breasts weren't the right size, or they wouldn't have sex with the boss, or they've never been pulled over because they were driving while black. So yeah, they feel things differently than we do. We've imposed injustice on them, and we have to help make it. We have to, in humility, walk a different path. And I think your book has done a tremendous job shedding some light on it. So I thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jeffroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.